Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled Medicare's New Drug Price Mandate, Healthcare and Innovation Implications. We are so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Sarah Clark. I am the Assistant Director of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. As a reminder, all opinions are expressed of those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. We are honored to be joined by a fantastic panel of legal experts. In order to get right to discussion, I will leave individual introductions to our moderator. After the panel discussion, there will be a short period designated for audience questions. We ask you to submit them via Zoom's Q&A feature, not the chat, and that the questions are pertinent to the topic at hand. Our moderator today is Adam Mossoff, who is a professor of law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He has published extensively on why patents, copyrights, and other intellectual property rights have been and should be legally secured to innovators and creators as property rights. His scholarship has been relied on by the United States Supreme Court, by lower federal courts, and by U.S. federal agencies. He has been invited to testify numerous times before the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives on intellectual property legislation. You can find out more about today's moderator and panelists at fedsoc.org. Full bio intros can also be found by clicking on the Resources tab on the Zoom call screen. With that, I will hand things off to Professor Mossoff to get us started. Professor Mossoff, thank you for joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Sarah indicated, we are just blessed to have a fantastic panel of very thoughtful, scholarly, and highly respected panelists to talk about this incredibly important issue at the intersection of kind of patent law, healthcare policy, and innovation policy more broadly. So the topic of our discussion today is, of course, the Medicare's new drug price mandate. This mandate was implemented in the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's a bill for which former Director Andrei Iancu has said is one of the most significant pieces of patent legislation that Congress has probably enacted in the last several decades, of which the word patent is never found once in the entire law. And why did he say that? Well, because the Inflation Reduction Act contains a provision that mandates that a, quote, maximum fair price, end quote, shall only be paid by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It goes by the acronym CMS in the Department of Health and Human Services from a list of the top 100 highest cost or highest priced drugs that Medicare pays for. So effectively, the CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, will be imposing effectively the price controls by dictating the price that drug companies can charge for their drugs, as opposed to what was originally has been up until now a negotiation between Medicare and Medicaid. The Inflation Reduction Act refers to this as a negotiation, but one could argue whether this is a negotiation of the sort of which one engages in the marketplace, or if this is a negotiation of the type of which which was described in The Godfather, where an offer is made of which cannot be turned down. And to emphasize this point, that it is it's not a traditional negotiation in that sense, and which described in the legislation, even though they use that term. So when CMS offers this price to the drug companies, they have three options. They can accept it, whatever that price may be, as determined by CMS. The law does not tell CMS how it's to determine this price. So it's left free to make the decision as to what it thinks is a fair price, as the term that the law uses. The drug company can say, no, we don't want to pay that price. Then the law imposes an excise tax on the drug company on the total revenues received from that drug. The law states that it applies to sales. And so it's not limited just the excise tax to sales to Medicare. It just says it says sales, and that would be construed as all sales because there's no limitation on it in the statute. And that excise tax can range up to as much as 1,900% of the total revenues received from the drug. So that makes it very clear that this is an offer that the drug company can't refuse when CMS makes their offer. The third option is that they can say no and remove all their drugs from Medicare and Medicaid. Now, that's problematic for lots of reasons, and which we'll be getting into. But one of those reasons is that approximately 40% of all drugs now purchased in the United States in healthcare are purchased through CMS. And so you would be effectively, being removed from almost one half of the drug market as a drug company. Excuse me. So, as you can see, this is a very significant piece of legislation that imposes effectively rate regulations, as lawyers call them, or price controls, as normally would be called, on the prices that can be charged by drug innovators for their new drugs. They're slowly adding more drugs. So there were first 10 drugs were added in 2026. Shortly before the Biden administration concluded its term in January, per the statute, it added another 15 drugs to the list, and they will add successively more and more drugs for the next 2 years up until by the point of 2029, there will be at least 55 drugs that will fall within the scope of a maximum fair price mandate, and arguably more will be added in the ensuing years. There's significant amount of litigation over this law now. There are probably about 11 pending cases in various courts around the country, making a slew of statutory and constitutional arguments, statutory under the Administrative Procedures Act, and on constitutional claims from takings to excessive fines to due process and things of this sort. So I wanted to give the overview so that our panelists didn't have to worry about kind of laying some groundwork, so they can just jump in and provide their insights as the scholars and thought leaders that they are. And I want now to turn it over to them, and they're going to run it from here on. So you're going to barely hear me, as you shouldn't want to hear any more from me. And I am a firm believer, and you want to hear more from them and not from me. So I appreciated that Sarah gave all my accolades and everything, but I'm just going to give name, rank, and serial number. And if you want to find out more about them, embrace this awesome online service we have. Google them, use ChatGPT, although be careful, it might be hallucinating. But you can finally find all of their many accolades and professional achievements that they rightly have earned in their excellent careers. So in order of just kind of kicking off our discussion, we have Lisa Ouellette who is the Deane F. Johnson Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. And then following her will be Brad Watts, who is Senior Vice President at the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And then last but certainly not least, then we'll have Dan Troy, who is Managing Director at the Berkeley Research Group. So let's get in. So let's have some fun now for the next 50 minutes. So Lisa, what are some of the legal and economic issues underlying the adoption of the maximum fair price provision in the IRA for the drugs that are being purchased by CMS?
Sure. So thanks for inviting me to chat about this. I've spent more time thinking about the economic issues than the legal issues. So on the legal issues, I'll just say that, to my knowledge, every district court and the one appellate court that have reached the merits so far have rejected the challenges and upheld the program. I'm sure we'll chat more about that later. But to me, the more interesting questions are the questions of innovation economics and the merits of this new program from a policy perspective. And my thoughts on it are more nuanced than just like pro or anti. And I think it's useful to kind of step back to first principles from kind of innovation economics 101. Like, I think the goal of drug pricing policy from an innovation perspective shouldn't be low prices per se. I think the goal should be to design policies such that society, including public and private investments, invests in innovation up to the point where the marginal cost equals the expected marginal social benefit of those investments in terms of saving lives and improving health. And given the current innovation ecosystem, like one of the most important policies affecting this calculus is the ex post reward that a firm gets for bringing a new drug to market. And these incentives matter. Like, even though the evidence base on patents generally is surprisingly weak, there is good evidence that increasing the returns to patented pharmaceutical products increases R&D effort on things that are more profitable. And the ex post reward that firms expect that depends on factors including the length of its exclusivity period and the price it can receive during that period. And so that's why the design of Medicare price negotiation matters for innovation. So I think we have an innovation policy problem when the reward for producing a new drug is misaligned from the value that drug provides compared to existing products. And currently we have errors in both directions. Like there are some times when the reward is too high, causing firms to invest in things that extend exclusivity and profits with little demonstrated added value for patients. And there are also areas where the reward is too low compared to social value, meaning that we as a society are missing out on drugs and vaccines that would likely otherwise exist. And that latter problem, the like too low problem, I think that is harder to measure, gets less attention. But there is some good empirical evidence of that, including a study documenting underinvestment in treatments for early stage cancer due to their long clinical trials and short exclusivity periods. And I think we should care about that if we want to be improving lives and improving access to medicines. Like we want those medicines to exist in the first place. So Medicare drug price negotiation, this is one of many recent efforts to deal with the too high problem. Since before this, Medicare had very little ability to impose any kind of market discipline on prices. I don't think we have great evidence yet on how well it's doing that. I think it is good from my perspective that both the statute and CMS's guidance require consideration of a drug's comparative effectiveness when setting these prices, which will hopefully limit the effect to which CMS errs too far toward reducing prices of drugs that do have evidence of added value. This program doesn't do much to deal with the too low problem, which has gotten less policy attention. I've argued in separate work that government payers like Medicare should in some cases be authorized to offer much higher reimbursements than they currently do for highly effective drugs and vaccines in areas where prices are currently too low to spur development. And I wish that this problem, the potentially life-saving medications that we're missing out on due to the design of the current system, got as much attention as the issues related to the prices of medicines that already exist. I think I'll stop there for my initial thoughts, but happy to jump back in with more later.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Thank you for that overview. It was fantastic. And continuing kind of our overview, opening comments. So, Brad, what are some of the kind of can you give kind of the high level legal and policy issues and concerns with the maximum fair price mandate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first I want to start out by saying, I agree with Lisa's the second half of what Lisa was saying about the too low problem, right? And I think many of the innovative companies I get to work with would probably share that assessment that there are some fundamental dynamics at play that do make it difficult to invest in some of these early stage treatments, some of these orphan diseases. And that is a real problem, right? And there are, I think, a ton of different people on the Hill and in policy, positions thinking about that issue. But I do think it's a critical one, right? Because there are a lot of patient needs that are being met because fundamentally, right, the company can't recoup what they're spending on R&D for trying to treat this disease state. And so I'm actually really glad you brought that up because I do think it's an important consideration that often gets lost in this broader debate around innovation, price controls, patent terms, et cetera. In terms of the, policy issues at play, as you noted, Adam, there at the start of the call, there's 10, I think, lawsuits that are currently ongoing against the IRA. At various stages. Some are still at the district court, some are on appeal, some are, I think, appealing questions as fundamental as standing. So there's all sorts of different stages of the litigation. Broadly, if I had to categorize where the lawsuits all stand, and I think you noted this as well, Adam, it's probably three buckets. One are just kind of challenges around implementation. So I think administrative procedure issues. Is CMS going about this kind of in a black box? The statute itself is pretty vague and ambiguous as to how CMS should go through this whole process. CMS and some of their guidance has been pretty vague and ambiguous and candidly less than transparent around how they're doing some of these things. So a number of challenges are focused on that piece. Some challenges are focused on the constitutionality of the issue, particularly when you start talking about price. I know one company that is challenging the IRA, has made the point in their litigation that if you applied these penalties to the extreme, it would be our entire global revenue in a single year. So you potentially have a really big issue with a takings problem, when you're talking about confiscating a company's entire global revenue for not agreeing to a negotiated price. And then the third bucket, and this is, I think, in conjunction with the other two arguments, almost every single, I think, piece of litigation is making the innovation argument, right? What are the long-term impacts this policy is going to have on the broader system? Again, these are all at various stages of play. I can't imagine any of these lawsuits are going away anytime soon. But obviously, policymaking doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There are plenty of efforts underway to look at this broader statutory scheme and what the right policies are to spur innovation, separate and independent from any outcome on litigation. Hopefully that's a good high-level summary.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. And then Dan, coming in to kind of complete our overall framing is kind of, so what are the economics of drug R&D, and what does this kind of tell us about the potential economic effects of the maximum fair price mandate in the IRA?
Okay, so I should just give a couple of disclaimers. One is I'm not an economist. I testify in pharmaceutical cases as an expert witness, and my views are my own, not the views of the Federal Society. One legal point and then a few economic points.
Okay.
The legal point that I'm not sure we've hit home adequately, although I agree with everything that's been said so far, is that the statute itself does not provide a right of appeal for anything. There is no right of judicial review about the drugs that are selected, the process that is used, or of the prices themselves. Now, that I think is pretty unusual in rate setting or price controls, because normally there's kind of some due process taking fundament which enables you to say that these rates are just and reasonable. For example, in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission context, normally you have some right to go and have someone else determine whether or not CMS, which is in this case the judge, jury, and executioner, the beneficiary and the deciderer, that there can be some independent check, and there is no check here. And I think that that's what puts this in a very different constitutional box. But I'm not going to talk about the constitutional issues. We throw around, and I totally agree with you, Lisa, on both the too high and the too low. But it's worth putting in perspective that when we talk about drug prices in America, 9% of our total healthcare spend is on medicines, okay? And 90% of all prescriptions are generic drugs. And of course, no generic drug would exist if not for brand name drugs. So if we want new drugs, like the brand new Gilead 2 times a year shot, which prevents people from getting HIV, and as someone who worked on Broadway in the late 80s and saw what a devastating disease that was, the fact that it is now preventable and treatable is a miracle. And we should, when we think about pharma companies, we should think about, the unbelievable good that has been done just in that arena. Or a cure for Hep C, ostensibly considered an expensive treatment when it was initially priced at $84,000, but it saves people from a liver transplant, which is more than 10 times that, never mind the incredible misery associated with that. So if we want new drugs like those, we want cancer treatments, and yes, there's certainly treatments that there aren't adequate incentives for, then we need to offer a competitive return. And I say this as having been the general counsel of GlaxoSmithKline and having been in the room when the board and the senior executive team decided how much money we were going to spend on R&D, okay? And the bottom line is, if there's not going to be an adequate return, the investors, the people who own the company, the board, will say either give us the money back in a dividend or give it back to us through a share buyback, but don't spend the money on R&D unless you're going to get an adequate return. Now, the famous Tufts number is that a new drug costs $2.6 billion on average. In 2017, there was an article in Forbes that said that for entities that produce more than 6 drugs over 10 years, which is to say basically big pharma, the median cost of bringing a medicine to market is $6 billion. Now, that does include normally the risks of failures, but more than 9 in 10 drug candidates fail. And if you're not going to, compensate people for the failures, then the entire business model doesn't work. So now let's talk about what the returns are. Deloitte puts out a report every year on the internal rate of return. And, some people think that there are these super competitive returns and pharma's making so much money. Well, in 2023, the internal rate of return was 4.3%. Not exactly a windfall. In 2024, it went up a bit to 5.9%. In 2022, it was 1.2%. These are not the kinds of returns that, enable governments to come along and say, we're just going to, dictate exactly what price we're going to pay for your drug, and that it will have then no effect on innovation. We already know that there's what's called a pill penalty in the Medicare sham negotiation bill. I won't call it a negotiation. It is a gun to the head. The pill penalty is if you, for a small molecule, you get 9 years of exclusivity. For a biologic, you get 13 years. And biologics actually are, they're great innovations, but on balance, I'd rather take a pill than a shot, right? Or have an infusion. And yet, many companies have talked about the fact that they are just stopping their programs for small molecule drugs because 9 years is really not necessarily enough for them to make back their investment. And we already know that this is skewing investment. And there have been estimates by people like Thomas Phillipson and others that estimate that the number of drugs that will not be developed because of this new Medicare program is well over 100. Now, it's the dog that didn't bark. We don't know what medicines we don't get. Well, if you're a patient and you're waiting for a cure, then you are very well aware of the medicines that are not going to be developed. Last point is there was a study done that showed that it was in the EU markets, and it found the consequences of a 10% drop in medicines in price, a 10% drop in medicine prices in price-controlled EU markets, where, of course, they do price control. And yes, America subsidizes the rest of the world. We could talk about that. There's no doubt about it. But it led to a 14% less venture capital funding, a 9% decrease in biotech startup funding relative to the US, 7% fewer biotech patents, see, at least getting the word patents in here, and an 8% increase in the delay in access to medicines. And so, we are literally killing the goose that has, that is laying the golden eggs. That is not to say that the pharmaceutical industry is perfect. It's far from perfect. There are lots of, places where, we're probably overpaying for certain innovations and underpaying for other things. But it's a driver of our health and is a driver of our wealth as a society. The biopharmaceutical sector should be the most esteemed and not the least esteemed. And this policy is absolutely catastrophic.
Can I just add too? I mean, if that's okay, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, thank you. Those are all really helpful stats. I've seen a lot of them. Some I had not heard, so that's really just educational for me too. But the only thing I'll flag is, this is not all anecdotal, right? Plenty of companies have said publicly that they were either reducing R&D spending into certain disease states or abandoning certain medicines that were in development entirely. Somewhere I have a document that tracks all of that. So I just point out that, I think Lisa's point earlier is right. I mean, we're only 3 years into the program, so we probably don't have a ton of data yet, but we are seeing plenty of innovative companies already signaling to the market, this is where we no longer find a value-based investment, given our limited R&D dollars. And I think what makes all this difficult, right, is again, and you brought it home to the patient-centric perspective. If you're a patient hearing that, not only is that demoralizing, but you then ask yourself, where is that potential cure coming from?
I agree with all. I mean, I think there's a lot we all agree on, and I think we agree that innovation matters and that the IRA will affect innovation. I think, given the empirical uncertainties here, there are different estimates on just how much, and the estimates are usually in terms of just like trying to estimate the number of drugs. Although ultimately, it's not like counting the number of drugs isn't really the relevant metric. Like what it matters which drugs we're going to be losing out on and how much value they would have. And I think that we don't have the data. Like if this is implemented in a way that it's really the drugs that have the least added value for patients that are negotiated down, like where there's the biggest wedge between private and social value, then that's less of a policy problem from a social welfare perspective. I mean, it's can be devastating for the pharmaceutical companies that used to be getting those profits, but from a like social perspective, that's less of a problem than if this causes a loss of innovation and the things that have the biggest added value for patients.
Right, but you're right, but we wouldn't I mean, there's no reason to think that the only drugs that are being targeted are the ones that you described in that first category as the ones that are providing the least marginal benefit, right? I mean, that's because that's not the criteria that CMS is applying. They're just looking at, you know, how big is the Medicare spend, which by the way means it's an often prescribed drug, which probably means it's more valuable rather than less valuable. That's an oversimplification. You know, there may be other medicines in there that's not true of. But you know what we're doing is going after the most successful medicines, which yes, obviously make the most money in some senses, but also are presumably the ones that are having, you know, the biggest impact, at least in one way or another.
I'll just.
I mean, yes, but just to say, like we do. At least in the statute and their guidance, CMS is required to consider the drug's comparative effectiveness compared to other products when they're setting the price, and I don't think we have great evidence on how well they're doing that. I mean, I do agree with, I think this was Brad's point, that like it would be useful if there were more transparency in what CMS is doing and what factors they will consider to select drugs and set prices, which is important for influencing development. But like the more that they can do to consider that added social, like added value in terms of extending lives and improving health compared to the existing standard of care, then the like better from an innovation policy perspective it is.
Just kind of
the other thing I think we can all agree on is that there's a provision which says if you go after the second indication, right, then all of a sudden the drug, if it's an orphan drug and there's a second indication, that it's into the program, and other than that, it's not in the program. And that is a clear disincentive for investment, right? Why would I spend a penny on, you know, looking for a second indication and a second use of that medicine if A, it can be used off label anyway, and B, the minute I do that research and get a second indication, it gets swept up in the price controls, whereas before that it's exempt from the price controls.
Kind of 3 points I'll make. And first, I mean, I think everyone I've seen, even groups that may aggressively push for price controls, seem to agree the lack of transparency and understanding of how this process works is an issue, right? To your point, Lisa, more broadly about innovation policy, it's hard to even sometimes have this debate because a lot of this is just in a black box. We really don't know how a lot of these decisions are being made, the different metrics. And so I think, you know, all of us, no matter where we stand on these issues, could benefit, right, from just more transparency as to how the program actually operates. You know, the second point, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at least with the first round of medicines that were selected for negotiation, it was price wasn't even a major factor in terms of what the price was when the medicine was selected. It seemed like they just went down the list and picked the 10 most popular medicines in Medicaid by
right,
bulk.
it was the spend. It was the spend, not the price. Yes.
Correct. I mean, which to me also strikes me as just, again, whether you agree with the policy or not, fundamentally at odds with the purpose of the statute. But then third and finally, and this is more of a bigger philosophical point, I mean, as we talk about value-based medicine, I mean, I guess the question I have is who determines the value, right? Because if you're a patient waiting for a medicine, it may only be marginally effective for the vast majority of the population, but if it's effective for you, I think you would say that has a lot of value. And so to me, this comes back and is just a personal opinion philosophically to kind of a first principle. Do we want the government deciding what is of value to society as a whole from a medical perspective? And that just gives me a bit of qualm. But, you know, I just point all three of those out for further topics.
I think Lisa's article that addresses that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do, to the extent we as a society have decided we are like that people should have access to these. Like, if we are going to require coverage and like with all the potential problems and concerns that have been raised about Medicare price negotiation, like we should recognize that it's not like the prior system was great there, and nor is it, I think, fair to really describe the prior system as like a functioning market, because there was very little ability for Medicare payers to control prices in any way. I mean, through Medicare Part D, which we've mostly been talking about, but also like Medicare Part B and Medicaid, the way they link government prices to private sector prices, like there's evidence about that distorting private markets in unhealthy ways. And so there's like a lot of ways that the government has already intervened in this market. But like, since we're in a world where I think like widely held social value of providing medicines for Americans who need them through programs like Medicaid, like if we're going to be providing them, then I think you need the government also making some assessment of what is it that we're providing, and is it like actually worthwhile, and not just providing anything that anyone wants, even if there's no evidence that it is actually useful. And there's like lots of organizations that, I mean, like in my the article you're referring to, the Valuing Medical Innovation, I went through the process that ICER, this nonprofit organization, uses to assess medicine's values, and I had some like critiques of some of the things they do, but I think it like is a legitimate and thoughtful effort to try to figure out what the value is for patients. That, I mean, it requires some difficult ethical judgments about how to value different kinds of health gains, and then also how to quantify, like how to, once you've converted a medicine to some metric, like QALYs or EVLYGs or any of those metrics that are used for health technology assessment, you then have to put a dollar value on that, which is a different ethical judgment. But
what's the title of your article again? I want to make sure people can.
Sure, it's Valuing Medical Innovation, co-authored with Daniel Hemmel.
Yeah, and if people Google Lisa Ouellette, Evaluating Medical Innovation, and type in the initials SSRN, you will find a downloadable PDF for it, open access. This is, by the way, this is a fantastic discussion. I have to say, it particularly warms my heart to hear the discussion about transparency and the need for transparency, because this is being hosted officially by the Regulatory Transparency Project at the Federalist Society. So it is a near and dear concern that we think that both sides of the aisle can agree on, that there always should be transparency in how our government functions at all levels. And a lot of really great issues have been raised. I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, we'll be very happy to take them. So you feel free to post them into the question box, and then I'll read them to the audience, and I'll read them to the panelists. So feel free to do that now if you wish, and then I'm just going to turn it back to our panelists. I'm just going to throw out another question or two, and then leave it to them to continue their great discussion. Dan talked about, the fact that there's an international context to this, that, that other countries are imposing price controls, and in fact, President Trump has actually explicitly said other countries are free riding off of our system. But also, Lisa and Dan and Brad have also talked about how the system's complex, and there's a lot of other things at play in the system. It may not be working perfectly, but there's a lot of impact on it. I know that there's discussions about the role of program benefit managers, these kind of midstream people. There's some legislation that's been proposed that's talking about them. So to the extent that there are concerns about prices, or in the desire within the context of having something like Medicare and Medicaid to lower drug prices for particular communities within the United States. So what other policy tools do we have potentially, or what other things that should our system account for in considering these types of issues or concerns for patients in our healthcare system? And I kind of just throw that out to the panel to suggest, but maybe we started with Lisa, so maybe we should just continue with Lisa, kicking that off.
Sure. I mean, there's like lots of policy proposals out there. I mean, most of the policy discussion has been focused on the drug pricing issue, and finding ways to reduce drug prices out of a concern that those are too high. And so in addition to the Medicare drug price negotiation, there's been discussion about like using the government's march-in rights on patents that were developed with federal funding as a, like the government has a right to effectively issue compulsory licenses on those in certain contexts. And so some people have suggested using that. I've done some empirical work saying that like I don't understand why this has gotten so much policy attention from either side, because it would affect so few actual drugs, because there's so few drugs that like only have patents with federal funding. There's been discussion about using a separate statute, I think it's 28 USC 1498, that under which the government, like patent infringement by or for the federal government can only be remedied by a suit in the Court of Federal Claims for damages. And so some scholars and commentators have suggested the government use that to basically issue compulsory licenses, like have generic production of high-cost pharmaceuticals with remedy in the Court of Federal Claims. And that doesn't depend on whether the patents have federal funding or not. So like that approach could be used. I don't think it's like actually gotten much policy traction, but there's a lot of scholarship on that. There's also scholarship about the government playing a larger role in drug production itself, like as a like directly procuring drugs, which the government does in some contexts. And I mean, we saw that in like in the COVID context, the government was kind of directly buying and then distributing drugs, which I think is also useful as an illustration of, sorry, this is a side here, but I think an important one, that like in these debates, when we talk about prices, like people use the word price in two different ways that I think confuse a lot of the debates. And there's really two prices that are relevant. There's the price that's received by the pharmaceutical manufacturer, and there's the price that's paid by the patient. And those don't have to be the same thing. So like COVID vaccines, the vaccine manufacturers got paid a lot of money for those vaccines, but the vaccines were free to all Americans who wanted them. And so I think it's important in these policy discussions that we recognize those can be delinked, and I think should be, because like I think there's a strong normative case for providing broad access to medicines and also providing a strong reward to incentivize the most valuable innovation.
I would just jump in on that last point. I agree with you, Lisa, 100%. So often the debate about like list price versus what the patient pays is totally absent in some of these policy discussions. And regardless of where you land on the policy issue, I do think it distorts the debate around what the right policy is, because the reality is very few patients pay the list price. That doesn't necessarily mean that they may not have their own struggles getting access because of insurance or whatever else. But the point being, I think when we lose sight of that distinction, it conflates a lot of issues and makes it much more difficult to pinpoint with precise policy what the right answer is. So I just am really glad you brought that up. Very good point.
So agree with that. But again, let's remember 90% of all prescriptions written in the United States are for generic drugs. And generic drugs are on average about 85% less expensive than brand name drugs. Oh, and by the way, generic drugs are less expensive in the United States than they are in the EU and in the UK. Couple of other points. You know, I totally agree with you, Lisa, about the need to do cost-benefit analyses if government is going to get involved in things. But when I was at FDA, there was a really interesting statistic that came up. We surveyed patients on their risk. We surveyed people on their risk tolerance who were not patients. Their risk tolerance was like 1 in 100,000, right? It was really, very low risk tolerance. Then we surveyed patients, people who are sick, and the risk tolerance went up radically. I mean, it was like 1 in 100. Okay, fine. If it'll help me, then I'm willing to take risks. And so, as we do cost benefit analyses, we should also take into account the way in which these medicines address the needs of people who really do need them. Two other quick points. I'm glad you raised the issue about, there is this misconception about the margin rights and how few drugs they apply to, because there's this misconception that NIH, which I have all veneration for NIH, but that NIH somehow contributes to all of the medicines that there are. That's just not the case. I mean, the leading 20 companies in spend on R&D in 2023, according to this Deloitte report, was $145 billion. That's 3 to 5 times the total NIH budget, and not everything that NIH spends is on medicines. Very little of it is on medicines. It's really on basic science. And even when the NIH, the few times that they've actually discovered a medicine, they have to hand it off to a pharma company, because it's the pharma companies that know how to get drugs through the FDA process. NIH has no idea how to do that. We saw that, when one of the big mistakes that was made in COVID was to try and have the CDC do the tests rather than have the private market do the tests. That did not work out well and had, frankly, catastrophic circumstances or consequences. The last point I'll just make is, I don't want to get deep into the issue of PBMs, but BRG did a study recently which showed that 50% of the drug spend goes to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the other 50% goes to other players. So the people who are actually discovering new medicines, making those medicines, manufacturing them safely, and getting them to patients are only getting 50 cents on the dollar of what we spend on medicines in this country.
I'll just jump in and say on the generic piece too. I mean, welcome the other panelists and kind of what you've heard. But I mean, I do notice increasingly a lot of the generics are also concerned about the IRA's price controls and what that does in terms of market distortion for their products. As we all know, right, generics operate on a very thin margin, like restaurant level margins. And so anything that further distorts the market away from generics is obviously very problematic for them. And so not only do we have the potential impact right on R&D for the brandeds, but the downstream effect, as you're kind of talking about, Deane, is what happens if we have problems in the generic marketplace that also then extrapolates out to the broader innovation or the broader medical ecosystem.
Adam, you asked about what public policy tools, and a few were mentioned, but the most important public policy tool is one that we used to sort of use a little bit, but we've never really used, and I don't think we're going to use in this, is instead of actually forcing American companies to, pay the price-controlled prices that are paid abroad, which will not allow for a reward to innovation, what we really should be doing in our trade talks is requiring other countries to pay a reasonable return instead of only a marginal cost return to, for medicines. Now that's kind of, I recognize that's kind of, very chimerical and fantastical and, wishful thinking, but, you can try and drive American prices down, but then there isn't going to be any reward for innovation, and we won't have new innovative medicines. Or you could say to the UK, where I'm sitting right now, where people don't have the same access to drugs, well, maybe you should pay a little more. Now, again, I don't think that's going to be the highest priority of any administration in their trade talks, but that's really what we need if we're going to try and address the problem of everybody free riding on American innovation. That said, I'll use one example: cancer drugs. The death rate from cancer fell in the United States 33% from 1991 to 2023. In the UK, it's fallen only 19%. God forbid anybody should have cancer, but if you have cancer, you want to be in the United States because we have more medicines here available than anywhere else. 94% of 124 new medicines launched globally between 2012 and 2021 are available in the United States versus 49% in OECD countries. This is where you have access to many different therapies and many different choices.
Yeah, that data is consistent with other data that I've seen too about how to this day still, in the others could correct me if I'm wrong, but well more than half of all new drugs are still invented in the United States.
Actually, 80% of the biopharmaceutical pipeline is here in the United States. That didn't used to be true until countries like Germany, again, killed their own golden goose by imposing price controls.
Now, I mean, Lisa raises has raised a really interesting point about the lack of data on on the impact of price controls, but this kind of creates kind of a catch-22 in a certain sense. Like if you like we can't make a decision about whether we should have price controls or not unless we see the negative impact of price controls. So we enact the price controls, we get the negative impact, but then we've undermined and killed the system through the price controls that are now showing us the negative impact, right?
But we
So
know what price controls do. I mean, again, I'm not the economist. I mean, look at the old Soviet Union. We know what price controls do. They drive scarcity. I mean,
okay, but
Well, and
okay,
I
good.
was going to say, Adam, to
Yeah.
that point, I mean, we do have examples, right, of what other countries have done and the impact, and Dan talked about some of that data. But for me, also the bigger concern, right, is it's also you have to look out on a 15 or 20-year time horizon. What does this do to the R&D infrastructure in this country, right? Because as we all know, you can't build that back overnight. So if you enact policies, right, that undermine that, it's not just the short-term 5, 6, 7, 10-year cycle of whatever medicine is in development. It's also 20 or 25 years down the road. What does your innovation ecosystem look like? Are we still the place where 80% of medicines, are developed 25 years from now if we keep imposing various forms of price controls? And so I think that's also in the policy discussion, something that's also lost is we can't, even if let's say we impose further price controls and 15 years from now we realize it's a policy mistake and wipe them all away overnight. You can't rebuild that infrastructure overnight, right? There's longer term investments that have to be then made. So I just think as part of the policy discussion, we have to keep that in mind as well. It's not a dichotomous, black or white, do X, do Y, and then you can reverse course at any time.
Lisa, I've invoked you, so I don't mean to, sorry to put you on the spot, but maybe since this framing, which is I think the kind of dominant classic framing for how we kind of assess patent policy, innovation policy, right? Is we need the data, we need to see what will happen. But then it kind of puts us in this chicken and egg problem of, well, when we adopt systems that might weaken or eliminate, then we get the data, but then it might be too late. So maybe you can address it's the classic metaphor question, I guess, by the professor. So of course the professor is asking the other professor, the foundational, first principles type question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's as bad as that. I mean, we don't have all the data. We don't know everything. We do know that incentives matter, and so like to the extent we can, like CMS can issue guidance on exactly how it's going to be implementing this program and make clearer what the role of comparative effectiveness is. Like I think that is useful, and it's not like they're suddenly saying every drug like on the day of launch is subject to like generic pricing. I mean, so I mean, yes, it does have a large impact on certain high spend drugs, but it is a small number of drugs that get added every year, and so I don't think that this is such a radical change that it's going to completely destroy the U.S. pharmaceutical sector.
so you make there is an interesting point that people forget. You ask people on the street, how many new drugs do we have a year? Very few people know the real numbers, which is the high, I think maybe once we touched 50, but it's these days sort of in the 40s, but a lot of them are kind of for rare disease or orphan drugs. Even as recently as Vioxx, I left the year after Vioxx, when FDA had kind of lost its scientific self-confidence and was getting battered, the approvals were in the 20s. So it's not like we're getting a lot of new drugs per year, right? And so, even a few medicines that we don't have I think do make a big impact. And the last study I'll cite, Adam, is RAND did something comparing new prescription drug availability and launch timing in the United States versus other countries. Okay, so we actually have, it's not a randomized clinical trial, but we have systems where they have price controls and systems where they don't. Okay, so 287 drugs launched between 2018 and 2022. 74% of them are available in the United States, and they're generally available at least a year faster than everyone else. 48% of those drugs are available only in the United States. 52% of those drugs are in Germany, 43% here in the UK, and 28% in Canada. Now, in many systems, I mean, I've had many conversations with people here in the UK. It was like, yeah, okay, I guess I'm getting, I'm not going to get new drugs. I'm 70 years old. I'm not going to get a knee replacement. I accept that as part of my belief in the NHS. I don't normally find that attitude among American patients.
This also isn't moving us toward UK style drug pricing. And I mean, I think that the US should be more like other countries in having like the government, given that we have public provision and coverage of drugs, I think there should be like more public paying attention to like whether we're getting value for those drugs. But I also think that the value that many other countries place on health gains is like vastly too low, and that even in the U.S. the value that ICER places on health gains is vastly too low compared to how we generally think about the value of health gains and life extensions in other cost benefit analysis contexts with other federal agencies, and the effect of this. I mean, like interestingly, when I talk about this with kind of people on each side of this debate, I think there's an ambiguous effect, which potentially has some potential for political compromise, in that like some pharma people I talk to like the idea that they could get much more than they're currently getting for some drugs, and that I think that like Medicare should be authorized to reimburse based on demonstrated evidence of value and like truly valuing health gains the way we do in other regulatory contexts. Some patient advocates I've talked to think that like this would obviously lower overall costs because basically all the new drugs have very little evidence of value, and so like if you're truly having value-based pricing, then like many of the drugs that we're currently getting don't have that evidence, and so I think there's like empirical uncertainty on that. I have not spent a lot of time like trying to understand the empirics of the assessments of like what that value is, but I think like there are questions about whether how many of those new drugs we're getting are like actually causing significant health benefits compared to the existing standard of care, which again is the point that we don't just need to be counting drugs, we need to be thinking about how good those drugs are and making it more profitable. And I think vastly more profitable to do things that like really are the most beneficial for patients.
Right. So, I mean, I can speak from very practical experience, having been in the industry, been in the room when people make these decisions. If we knew in advance, okay, here's the system by which, if I make investments and I show that there's value in this medicine, and then I will get rewarded for it, then, each medicine is a 10 to 15-year investment, as Brad said, but then I can make decisions and say, okay, I want to maximize my profits. That's why I'm in business. That's why investors give me money. I also want to help patients, which is why I'm in the industry. But, if I can make more money by making a drug that has more comparative effectiveness, then fine. But ironically, the ICERs of the world and NICE and whatever, they make judgments based on comparative effectiveness data that if you actually did that study and tried to communicate about that to your patients, FDA would almost certainly say you cannot communicate that because the study isn't adequate. The standards that FDA imposes for making any kind of comparative efficacy statement are basically impossible to meet.
I mean, this is a fantastic discussion. I mean, we probably could have a 3-hour webinar on these issues. Unfortunately, we only have an hour, and so we did get 2 questions, primarily related to the international arbitrage issue and the kind of the classic international public choice problem that we talked about of other countries freeloading off of the United States and how this is happening. I think this was addressed in both directly and indirectly by comments by Brad and Dan and Lisa throughout our discussion. And so I just want to kind of bring us to a conclusion and kind of give each of our panelists kind of an opportunity to kind of give a few kind of closing remarks. Again, thank you for the fantastic exchange. And we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start off with you, Brad. So just a couple like 1 or 2 minute remarks, and then we'll bring it home for the audience.
I'll try to keep it to 45 seconds.
Okay.
I mean,
Oh,
first,
perfect.
thanks to the FedSoc for hosting this. Thanks to Lisa and Dan for being on the panel with me. look, I think you said it best, Adam, right? These issues are really complex and there are really big real world implications about getting policies around pharmaceutical innovation right or wrong. I think what you saw here, right, is just how complex those issues can be in a microcosm. I think as we think ahead to not only future policies, but where we want to be as a country in 20 to 25 years, it's important we get it right because we don't want to be an innovation desert, but we do want to be a place, right, where people get, the types of cures and treatments that add a quality of life. And so, I welcome the chance to have this discussion today, and I hope we do more of it in the future because I think informed policymaking is the best in this area and not kind of cliches that fit neatly into political slogans.
Thank you. Yeah. Dan?
I- So thank you to everybody for participating, and at least I've scanned your article, but I look forward to learning from you and reading it even more deeply. I think we know what doesn't work. We can look at other countries where it's a monopsony, where the government is the only buyer, and where patients are not actually literally allowed to learn about the medicines because there's no direct-to-consumer advertising and there's no communication to patients. And we know that those systems have are far less than ideal. Now, our system is not far from ideal as well, but we are, the ones who are driving innovation and making modern miracles, like I said, with respect to this new Gilead drug or curing Hep C. And I'm just very afraid that, people are not taking into account the very important thing you said at the beginning, Lisa, which is incentives matter. People seem to believe that, that they can just force drug companies to, make medicines and they'll keep doing it no matter what, the incentives are. And that's just not going to work.
All right. And then Lisa?
Yeah, I generally agree with all of that. It's been a great discussion. I'll just add on the international point that, like, I agree we pay more than other countries, and in that sense, other countries are free riding us. Although I don't think that's a good reason to cause us to stop investing, and like the amount that we are paying should be based on considering what makes sense for American patients, and we shouldn't pay more just or pay less just out of the sense of like we don't want to pay more than our economic peers. And I think generally, like whatever the next steps of pharma policy reform are, I hope that policymakers remember that things like encouraging generic entry aren't important goals in and of themselves. Like that it's a means to the end of saving lives and improving health through having the right structure of incentives and access, and that this overall goal should be kept front and center.
Excellent. Well, I mean, we often talk about the aspirational ideal of having evidence-based conversations and to promote evidence-based policymaking by our officials. And I really want to thank all three of our panelists for exemplifying this ideal in fact, in this what I think was a really robust and very substantive discussion. So thank you to all of you. And I'll now turn it back to the Federalist Society at Sarah to close it out.
Thank you so much, Professor Massa, for moderating, and thank you for everyone on our panel for joining us and for sharing your insights today. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in and for your questions. For more content like this from the Regulatory Transparency Project here at the Federalist Society, please visit us at redproject.org. Thank you.